A reading of A Different Christianity, Early Christian Esotericism and Modern Thought by Robin Amos. The introduction, Searching in the Ruins. In investigating ancient traditions, the question is always, how can one begin? Some ancient ideas can first be understood only by seeing the reality behind them. One can learn much even by seeing the physical changes that have occurred alongside the changes in ideas. So first, I shall write of how our world has changed, of how our faith has changed, and for this, it is certainly better to speak of experience. For at this moment, we begin to build a bridge over the very boundaries of the world of ideas. This was what took me to the great monastery of St. Andrew beside the road into Caris, capital town of the monastic republic of Mount Athos, known as the Holy Mountain, a 40-kilometer peninsula off the mainland of northern Greece, which is still today an autonomous monastic republic, although under the protection of the Greek government. When I walked into the courtyard, the monastery lay empty of monks, as it has since a plague in 1926. Greek schoolboys in black monastic robes came and went to one wing. Elsewhere, nobody stirred. Earlier that week, the first liturgy since the monastery had closed in 1926 had been held in the enormous Catholicon church. With my friend, the American monk Germanos, I walked up to the marble portico and hammered on the rusted iron-framed glass doors. Nobody answered. Eventually, one of the boys came over to see what we were doing and explained that in all that enormous complex, there were only 2 caretakers. Often they would not answer the door. Often they were out. The marble portico was badly cracked. Once it had been magnificent. Now it was heading for ruin. Carved into the stone was the date of its building, 1910. Although I failed to get into the monastery, in the fallen roofs, the neglected, empty buildings, I gained a sense of something hidden elsewhere. This was the visible result of what had happened in 1918, since frozen in time. That was when a world had come to an end, and here at the monastery of St. Andrew, nothing has really happened since except wind and weather. Here time has done its work unstayed by human hands. Here you can see the end of that world, of the tremendous change whose form has been hidden elsewhere by renewed activity. Here the disaster that everyone ignores, the collapse of an age, is clearly visible to the eye, giving an image that is a surprising, appropriate introduction to the detailed study that follows, a summary of years of investigation into the esoteric Christian tradition. It will help to set the scene and to give depth of meaning to our theme, for this book summarizes investigations that I have now been working on almost full-time since the beginning of the 1980s. In that time, my investigations have led me to certain places where ancient truths still dwell, as well as to connections with surviving students of those who have sought the same knowledge in the same way in faraway places. In time, they led me to certain important sources in which this ancient tradition survives, at least in part to the present time, particularly around the eastern end of the Mediterranean in Greece and Egypt. By now, the conceptual and psychological climate of the West has gone so far from the inner meaning of early Christianity that to restore these ideas to their original meaning at first seems almost impossible. Speaking on television at the New Year heralding 1994, Archbishop Carey of Canterbury Primate of the Anglican Church clearly interpreted one of the many scriptural passages promising peace of mind to those who turn to God as a promise to be kept after death. In doing so, he denied one of the great promises of the inner church, the promise of present help, specifically defined throughout the early fathers, although admittedly often referred to in the Bible with the kind of ambiguity that allows such mistakes. Yet the inner truth and its psychological components, which find their justification in the gospel passage that says, quote, "They that are whole have no need of the physician," Mark 2:17, survives, or persistently re-emerges. This therapeutic view survived in medieval Europe in the attitude that treated Christ as the doctor of souls. It survives in Greece today in the mountain fastnesses where hermits hide. One Athos hermit once explained his role to me by saying that his work was like that of a doctor, but not a doctor for the body. Today, this attitude is re-emerging as a growing movement that seeks to distinguish between inner and outer interpretations of Christian doctrine, and refers to the outer form as moralistic or sometimes legalistic. By this they mean a faith that judges, that asks things of us, without giving us the means to achieve those things. The ancient inner tradition took a view opposite this. It gave people the means to be moral, then allowed the form of that morality to emerge naturally. It survives in the Orthodox Church, dispersed from its homelands into the West, custodian not only of the empty monastery of St. Andrew on Mount Athos, but of many still active monasteries on the same peninsula, and of the true keys to the forgotten tradition that was once taught there. Truth it may have, but its resources and its capabilities were and still are generally swamped by lonely exiles who ask it to speak not primarily of God, but of some inexpressible motherland. It began to reassert itself almost spontaneously in the 1930s, but failed to do so because of the war. The German phenomenologists asked the right questions, but the breakdown of their world stopped them short of finding a resolution to the desperation inherent in their formulation, and this robbed them of any coherent answer that would have broken them out of their subservience to the subjective images of phenomena. Any hint of something out of sight of the mind, of something more than an image, a genuine hint of which might have ended their ridiculous assumption that the ego is no more than an image of an image. There was the impasse of the physical sciences, in which Eddington in the 1920s could already see the need for a new epistemology that might reconcile human thought with the paradoxical perceptions of quantum physics. By the late 1930s, quantum physics was to have a more sinister role, and it was the late 1960s before this arcane knowledge again began to interest the post-war world in implications other than weapons technology. By then, Eddington's question had been forgotten, and little did Eddington know, anyway, that the key to this enigma, a new epistemology that encompasses our contemporary view without being limited to it, had already been provided more than 1,000 years before in the 2nd century works of Gregory of Nyssa, an ancient Christian author totally ignored by modern philosophy. Even the great physicist and philosopher Erwin Schrödinger and the highly religious Albert Einstein remained unaware that the questions they debated had been answered by fathers of the Church long before the fall of Byzantium. Even now, few can see the direct connection between the paradoxes of particle physics and the ancient Russian philosophical method of antinomies, a philosophical tradition preserved intact to the present, but finding its roots in the gospel itself. The First World War ended an age, and cutting off the prime of our youth, it cut off our innate access to the strengths of the past. The time before the second was too brief for new growth to go deep enough to root itself. After the war, the unfinished new growth that had begun in the 30s but never come to term was rooted out and cast aside, to be forgotten by the generation that followed. Only now, 60 years later, can we begin again to repair the ruins of even the recent past, to pick up the pieces of that era in relation to the deeper questions of life. Only now can we say a prayer for those forgotten pathfinders of the 30s, and only now can we make yet another attempt to cultivate the soil of the human spirit, remembering that we are ourselves children of our century, so that in any such cultivation we must begin with ourselves. So, as with others before us, it was from an awareness of that situation that my researches into the early church and the survival of its ideas began shortly after 1980. And it is a few of the surprisingly large number of discoveries made during those researches that I am going to describe in this book, as well as drawing in on some of the less well-known discoveries of those who have preceded us in this search, particularly those of Boris Moraviev, Russian émigré, historian, and little-known teacher of esotericism who worked in France and Switzerland at the time of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, and whose 3-volume work Gnosis, although for many still difficult to understand, provides the most comprehensive and precise primer on this difficult subject. A research report. This book, then, is a report on the researches I have just introduced so dramatically, a study of certain ideas and methods known in the early church, but lost, in one way or another, to modern Christianity. This loss is, of course, at the root of the idea that esoteric means secret. Nothing could be further from the truth. At the same time as being a properly documented study of these lost ideas, this is also a necessity, the summary of personal search, and links the discovered ideas to personal experience. It does this not so much to provide a final definition as to suggest to readers how they should develop their own understanding of the same ideas. This is because the esoteric tradition is so easily misunderstood that to avoid dangerous mistakes, actions should only be taken on the basis of recognition of a clear personal understanding, in which the teaching is verified by direct experience. I should also add that although these researches have been supported to a degree unusual in such a work, sometimes by taking them to a point of academic accuracy, it is in large part a study of an unwritten tradition, and it has been found, not surprisingly, that documentary evidence of an unwritten tradition is not always available. It began with a search for the springs of Christian sanctity, a search for the source that I believe is found in the esoteric or inner teachings of the early church. Not for a different gospel, but for a different way of understanding the gospel. So, what do I mean by sanctity? At a workshop in New York recently, I asked about this in the form of a question that now provides the basis of this book. My question was this: which of you has ever met a saint? This is how my own investigation began. But the question has, of course, been answered and even evoked answers many times in the past, and I must have something more to say about how those have emerged over the years. Before you buy the animal, you must read the pedigree. Several centuries ago, there was a move in the West, probably not the first, to rediscover in the writings of the fathers of the Church, writings that then were inaccessible to most of those who sought, Christian truths that were no longer a part of Western Christian teaching. Again, in Europe in the 19th century, some of these works were translated and made generally available, and were clearly valued by a few souls who glimpsed the treasures hid in them, but none of these attempts succeeded in restoring this knowledge to the mainstream. The time was not right, and what these texts contained was so different from what is now generally understood as Christianity, that by that time practically nobody possessed the tools with which to grasp those ancient truths. In Russia, the story was different, because the times were different. In the 19th century, Russia was still in the throes of westernization, forced on her by Peter the Great. Western, or at least westernized philosophical and scientific thought existed alongside surviving streams of thought and spirituality in an Eastern church that later survived the revolution itself. The interaction between these two powerful rivers gave rise to similar investigations, and the discovering of these ideas by people in active contact with the spiritual practices that endure, almost unchanged over the centuries in certain corners of the Eastern Church, bore different fruit, a greater valuation of the ideas discovered, which led, as a result, to more active and sometimes more successful attempts to apply this ancient knowledge. In the 19th century, certain teachers appeared to transmit this knowledge. Some of them, such as Saint Theophan the Recluse, were conventional. Others, laymen with more Western backgrounds, were highly unconventional, both by the standards of the Eastern Christendom and Western humanism. An important work in the esoteric tradition is the Philokalia. Its origin came from a key event during the history of this path. Part of the meaning of these teachings has been lost more than once, even by the monasteries. Then it has had to be restored. A major example is that of Paisius Velichowski, who restored the original meanings of the text in the 18th century, long before this work was translated into English. The text used in the earliest version of this work sparked a major renewal in the inner tradition that shaped the form it now takes in Eastern monasticism. This renewal of the inner tradition, led by Velichowski, began on Mount Athos and then spread, carried by Velichowski first to Moldavia and afterwards to Russia. The Greek version of the Philokalia, formed by Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, primarily from the text collected by Velichowski, provides a primary technical instruction for the monks of the Eastern Church who carry on the same tradition to this day on Mount Athos, as well as in many other parts of the world. Since then, the parallel volume to the Philokalia, the Gerontonkin, teaching stories about the same early fathers in very Middle Eastern style, has been translated several times with varying degrees of success. Thomas Merton selected from this collection's stories that are meaningful to modern man. Another emigre, almost certainly a direct successor to the Russian seekers of the 19th century, Boris Moraviev, wrote in the 1960s in French his own attempt to summarize his own discoveries in this field and discoveries unpublished by those who had gone before him. I myself have had the honor to publish the 3 volumes of his main work between 1990 and 93. Other key texts have been published recently as a result of an initiative by Father Nikon, P.D. Ouspensky's friend who was a hermit on Mount Athos, Unseen Warfare, also by Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, later re-edited by St. Theophan the Recluse, one of the greatest spiritual teachers of the Russian Church, who died as recently as the 1890s. In The Art of Prayer by Abbot Cheriton of the monastery of Alamo, an ancient and at one time enormous monastery, which preserved its spirituality in difficult times by moving across the border from Russia to Finland. Thus, many of the ancient texts are now more readily accessible. Their readership is increasing because many readers obtain sudden insights from within their passages. But their message, in full, nobody in the West can read, for it is a message of repentance, metanoia, and it cannot be read in any depth and then ignored. So, the gap in understanding still remains between Christian East and Christian West. All of this great effort has not yet revealed anything clearly, but it has definitely shown that there is something here to discover, although it is very difficult to discover it in full. The idea of metanoia, of the possibility of such a change, as far as I know, was first reintroduced to the West in the 1930s by Maurice Nicole. The meaning and specific methods were described in a fragmentary way in the Philokalia, translations among other places, but metanoia, repentance, is the essence. This one word is not understood until we realize that it distills the underlying principle, the practical objective of a complete discipline, one that reaches its goals through a myriad of variations and alternative methods. Although today metanoia still forms the basis of the practical work of the monks of the Eastern Church, few even of the more important methods of approaching it are understood in the West, and the basic principles in the form of a complete Christian worldview based on faith, but not on blind faith, seem to have been almost entirely forgotten. Once read, understood, and accepted, these basic principles and the commandments or rules that accompany them form the foundation of the whole process. They lead, although normally not without a struggle, not without a strong resistance from past habits, to a true reversal of direction in the reader, bringing to the catechumen, to the threshold, the point of entry of the path of transformation, the path of metanoia. But to enter the path of metanoia is to seek to pass through the straight gate of the gospel. And, quote, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. Matthew 19:24. Its import is so difficult, it demands such efforts, such struggles by those who try to apply it, that instead it is often rejected. If this principle were accepted by enough people so that we could say that it was once again understood by the churches, especially at the present time, it could only lead to a true change of direction by those churches. If understood at the basic level, it could lead to the creation of methods suited to modern individuals and to the situation in which we live. If assimilated by Western civilization at large, which would only happen if many individuals came to understand it and its importance, it might even change the direction of that civilization. But what kind of change that might be is the subject of my postscript and should rest for the moment. The purpose of this book, then, is not simply to introduce valuable texts, but to explore the meanings that occur often many times and expressed in many ways, not only in the text now being translated into English, but in early texts that have already been made available. I also hope to show, where possible, how these early meanings link with and very often answer our own questions about ourselves and our world, and how they relate to modern thought on this same subject. In the time of growth from those early beginnings, something changed. And the idea behind this book is that this change must concern us now. As our relation to Christianity has changed, our Christian worldview and our idea of Christianity have both also changed until we can no longer recognize their original forms in them. If we look at the great faiths of the world, all the major faiths have an inner tradition, except, at first sight, Christianity. But is this true? The thesis of this book is that Christianity, too, has or had such a tradition, but that in the development of reason, humanism, and then the physical science, that inner tradition has been effectively forgotten or lost. I should expand, too, on the idea that this tradition has been effectively lost. The fact is that the Christian inner tradition is not entirely lost, but its significance has been lost to sight, and as a result, its actuality has been neglected or reduced to a curiosity. Its practical application has been restricted to a few hundred monks, most of them in Eastern Christendom. Its texts are few of them translated with their original practical significance in mind. Its exercises are mostly forgotten. Even its usefulness is no longer understood. Its importance to society as a moral restorative is entirely unknown to the majority of thinking men and women. This, as we understand it, has been the fall of Christendom. This tradition that has fallen or been lost, in fact, forms the context of the personal fall and the personal resurrection to which we referred above, the background against which monastic writers of the Eastern Church speak continually of the monk's many falls. As St. John of the latter says, quote, "He falls and gets up again, falls and gets up again," end quote. This book, then, is an attempt to rediscover that tradition of consciousness and make it generally known. As it refers to consciousness, it applies even to those who, unable to follow the way of the monk, walk the esoteric path by methods generally unknown to the monks. They will fall, and they must get up again, day after day and year after year. Those who regard a single rising of this kind as being born again must realize that to be Christian in the full sense of the word, to be Christian as the fathers understood the word, they must reach the point where they are born again, not once, nor even many times, but many, many times each day, and then must pass this point. These many awakenings, many little rebirths, are part of the process by which we can eventually be born from above. With the fall, man was cast out of the garden of the inner life to till the earth. As the higher faculties are lost, the higher vision, the higher consciousness is lost to sight. As a recent commentator says about the fall, something that we should perhaps memorize, so clearly does it define our times, that today, quote, the heavenly world has disappeared from man's field of vision and has become an invisible world. There remains only the sensory, material, visible world, like an island in the ocean of the invisible world, end quote. A method of therapy. What we can say at this point is that in studying the inner life of man, this material constitutes a true psychological science and an effective system of therapy that is older by many centuries than anything that passes today by that name. More to the point, as I hope I shall show in this book, once adapted to the different conditions of modern life, it is also a very precise and workable science, despite certain basic differences from modern psychology. All the great religions of the world have a tradition that exists just to meet man's need for inner renewal, for healing of the soul. What has been called a therapeutic tradition, a means of making saints. Hinduism has its yoga. Islam has Sufism. Buddhism has a number of meditation traditions, including Zen. Only Christianity, at first sight, lacks such an organ. But that is not so. Christianity has its ways, an almost forgotten mystical science, a science of metanoia, sometimes called the, quote, royal road, that is akin to psychological means of therapy, yet more than merely psychological in character. And this ancient and forgotten science not only parallels these Eastern traditions, but it is entirely Christian in character. This early Christian psychology reflected the gospel statement that, quote, they that are whole have no need of the physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Mark 2:17. The problem is that this therapeutic tradition has been suppressed as a result of pietism and moralism that dominate modern Christianity. These tendencies to externalize the faith exist in all churches and all faiths. They are characteristic not of one religion, but of a particular type of human immaturity. They belong to the lower stages of spiritual life, when people are using only one of the functions of their psychological life. They are driven by the senses and by what has been formed within us through the senses. But this practical method creates a true or spiritual morality by developing conscience. The therapeutic interpretation is not any moralistic or legalistic doctrine, but a practical method aimed at specific results. This interpretation is exact and has its own scientific method. One Greek author wrote, quote, sanctity does not have a moral meaning, but an ontological one. In this, the truthfulness of what is believed is subject to the test of praxis, the test that asks, does it work? This uses an essentially Christian definition of sickness, for Christ was concerned with the spiritually sick, with man in his fallen state. Directly because of this difference, it aimed not at manipulation, but at liberation. This Christian psychology was very different, and its morality was not enforced but emerged naturally from within the individual, whereas the modern equivalent frequently views ethical activity as having to be improved on individuals from outside. It was P.D. Ouspensky who pointed out that the modern psychology is primarily a tool of a medicine which studies pathologies, so that it sometimes calls itself abnormal psychology or of the social sciences which have sprung from this stream. This ancient psychological method, then, was a form of traditional knowledge, having different rules for verification from those of modern psychological science, but they are genuine working rules. In its time, it had its own consensus, and this evolved over time as does any modern scientific consensus, but was very different from that of contemporary psychology because it had very different goals. The esoteric tradition necessarily used words with quite specific meanings different from their general usage. Divergence from this tradition led to these meanings being forgotten. Once this point is reached, and it was reached more than a millennium ago, a new process enters in. Readers find themselves faced with words in a context in which these words appear meaningless. The result is that people regard such words as superstitions, in the sense that they seem to have no recognizable meaning. Thus, what is first forgotten is afterwards discredited. Words can be transmitted in writing, and this can be a dead process. But the meanings must also be transmitted, and this must be a living process. Without the transmission of meaning from the same source, the particular meaning of the words is lost. And then, in that context, the words themselves become meaningless. This was the reason for the researches that led to this book, and the purpose of this book is to restore some of those lost meanings. This whole concept leads to a practical way of presenting these ideas. This can be put in modern terms by utilizing the word recognition. The goal of texts in this tradition, and the characteristic by which texts that genuinely belong to this tradition can be identified, is that they are written for recognition. The meaning of an idea must be understood and recognized, and the meaning of this particular idea, too, must be understood and recognized. We are not using the word recognition here in the sense of public recognition. Usually nothing was further from the minds of practitioners of this ancient science. They taught a traditional knowledge, and in it their scientific method depended on the students accepting the truth of what they taught, by discovering for himself and then recognizing what it was they were describing. The fact that they had in general a consensus about what was true makes it clear that they all, in fact, although step by step, not immediately, came to recognize the same things. Experience will enable the present-day student who strives for such a level of accuracy to recognize that this situation, carried out rigorously, eliminates all possibility of doubt. A reading from A Different Christianity, Early Christian Esotericism and Modern Thought by Robin Amos. Continued reading from the introduction, a section entitled Saints Are Always Somewhere Else. For Westerners, the visible sign of the loss of the early kind of Christianity, of the loss of metanoia as a way of spiritual life, especially for those belonging to Protestant churches who today do not formally recognize new saints, is that saints always seem to live somewhere else or to have lived in some other time. Many of us, indeed, see this fact simply as a sign that we have outgrown such ideas as religion and sanctity. But this tells more about the person who believes it than about any wider reality. In this, young children often know better than their elders, for this mystery of the missing sanctity is really a most serious question for us all. And the sophistication, the cynicism that hides the question, is no more than a tissue of self-deception. But to go back to that question with which I began, if you answer no, you have never met a saint, my next question for you would be, why not? If you honestly believe you can answer yes, not almost, or there's someone I think is a saint, but an unequivocal yes to this question, my next is instead to ask you, how many saints have you met? The point of all this is to take a serious look at this question. Many of us will already realize that whatever their own answer, many people now believe that the time of saints is past, that they do not occur anymore, and have not occurred for many centuries. This is almost, but not entirely true. What did I know when I began my researches? I knew that some genuine saints have been recognized within the last century, more since 1800, particularly in Russia, but also in Greece. But many of the lists below were only canonized in 1988, with the millennium celebrations of the Russian Church. In fact, in this world, the list of recent saints is actually considerably longer than one might expect. It is not the reality, but our view of it that I am questioning. An incomplete list of recent saints includes Saint Theophan the Recluse, born 1815, died 1894, canonized 1988 as part of the millennium celebrations of the Russian Church. As a young man, he became a monk, then higher monk, priest monk, bishop, abbot, and finally anchorite. He guided thousands by mail and edited two of the world's greatest books on the life of prayer, as well as writing several other important works. His teachings help to clarify the inner tradition in modern terms and are referred to frequently in this book. Saint Seraphim of Sarov, died 1833, whose teachings help to clarify one important factor of the inner tradition, so that they too are referred to in this book. Saint Therese of Lisieux, died 1897, who was called to the life of prayer as a child and became one of the great spiritual inspirations of the Roman Church. Her writings are referred to in this book. Saint John of Kronstadt, died 1908, a priest in the Russian naval town of Kronstadt, whose ability to help people reached so many that a series of guest houses had to be built to accommodate those who came to him. Saint Nectarios, died 1920, whose shrine on the Greek island of Aegina has in the past few years been the scene of many miracles, including miraculous conversions. Saint Arsenios of Cappadocia, died 1926, a saint who said very little, but who, over many years, worked a great number of miracles to assist those living around him. Saint Silouan of Athos, died 1933, a massive Russian peasant who nearly murdered someone in Russia, became desperate about his lack of self-control, and went to see Saint John of Kronstadt. From there he went to Athos on the advice of Saint John, and became a man of impressive abilities and very great spirituality. His teachings are referred to in this book in order to clarify one inner aspect of Christian tradition that is difficult to understand by drawing only on earlier sources. Several saints have also been canonized by the Romanian Church, but we have listed enough examples of recent Eastern saints. In particular, you will notice that in this list there are no Protestant church saints. It would be interesting to ask the Protestant churches whether, indeed, they believe that saints are created today, or more specifically, whether they have under consideration the canonization of any of their recent members. One might even ask what they imagine the significance of saints to be, beyond the obvious, that they are often very good role models, if only they weren't so impossible to follow. Certainly the Protestant churches have some very splendid people, but in the early church, that was not quite what the word saint meant. To the early Christians, a saint was something else. In fact, all the individuals listed above were in some sense direct followers of the early fathers of the church. Nearly all of them, as well as certain others who will appear later, referred at some time to the royal road or royal way. The significance of these facts will become increasingly apparent the further we read into this book. When I asked my original question, I turned the question toward the audience as individuals, asking them another question that every sincere seeker should ask himself or herself. I asked them then, as I ask you now, which of you who think of yourselves as Christians has not asked the catch question, how can I be more Christian than I am now? Or, to put it another way, how can I free myself from my own bad habits? How can I learn to live to my own highest principles? How might I feel growing in my own heart the qualities described in the Sermon on the Mount? How can I learn to turn the other cheek? How can I love my enemies? Behind this is a basic question given by my researches. If people understood what my researches have confirmed, that saints are made holy, not born holy, then it would be possible at least to begin to answer these other questions, and that in such a way that we could understand how we ourselves might change if we wanted to. Saints are made, with the help of our Lord, certainly, but made, not born holy. Those of us who want to see a better world might be well advised never to forget this. From Investigation of the Past, a New Vision. As the abbot of an Athos monastery wrote recently, when the monk possesses the grace of repentance, he knows the true God, not some idea of God. In actual fact, the Christian esoteric or inner tradition is in every respect a true tradition that is the equal of the great inner traditions of the East. Unfortunately, due to certain accidents of history, the texts of the tradition have been so long unknown in the West that, although they are now becoming available, their special meanings have failed to reach us. This has left them meaningless, which in turn has seemed to confirm the facile idea that they have now been disproved by science. Diluted to the point where it lost its power to produce results, and with its credibility weakened because its meaning has been lost, the inner tradition has proved an embarrassment to churches who wanted to appear scientific, wanted to be accepted in circles that also appeared scientific. Because of this, the very idea of an inner tradition has been swept under the carpet when nobody was looking. Yet it was the strength of psyche this part of the Christian tradition gave to many individuals that explains the way the early martyrs of the church made such an impression on those who saw them, so that the Christian church in its early centuries, before it became divided, almost entirely supplanted competing faiths. The initial growth of the early church was the direct result of its inner power to transform the individual. As this ability has declined below a certain point, the church itself has begun to lose membership. Whether we believe that, as I shall suggest later in the book, a spiritual reawakening is now taking place, or believe only that it should do so, with either of these viewpoints, we will see the value of recovering a lost Christian tradition of knowledge about the inner experience that some of the most valued members of the church, among them saints, bishops, abbots, monks, hermits, and learned doctors, have accumulated over nearly 20 centuries. But particularly, what they learned in the early days of the church when the initial energy given by gospel and resurrection was still at its most intense. The background to the loss of this great reservoir of truth is that in 2,000 years, Christianity has built up an enormous corpus of knowledge and ideas. Nobody can know all of this, and so everybody had to be selective. More than this, there are both historical and psychological reasons why this selective process has developed a particular bias over the centuries, so that some of the knowledge acquired by the church during its early years has for so long been forgotten. Either it has been totally forgotten, or in other cases the words are remembered, but part of their meaning, their significance, has been forgotten, so that they are effectively misunderstood. The criteria for interpretation have changed with the times until what is believed now as a result of reading the gospel is entirely different from what was believed in the early days of Christianity. Now, if the early meanings are made available again, we find them difficult to understand. And if we do get close to them, we discover that it is even more difficult for us to see their value to us, their relevance to our personal questions, and to the main questions of the civilization of which we are part. The connections have worn thin with time, although the problem of the misunderstanding of inner knowledge is not a new one. We no longer have the intellectual tools to recover that early knowledge. We have replaced them with a newer model. As long ago as the 3rd century, Origen, head of the Alexandrian catechetical school previously led by Clement of Alexandria, wrote that the Bible should be interpreted in ways other than historical, because in the historical interpretation, the inconsistencies of the text make it look foolish. 16 centuries later, vast numbers of scholars now study the Bible simply as a history text, and in the attempt to maintain scientific objectivity, regard it as misleading to study it against criteria other than those of history. But nobody asks the question, if this is only history, why is it studied so much more than other historical texts? A commentator in the 1993 issue of Bible Review claims that to follow the historical interpretation conscientiously, it is necessary to disbelieve in basic tenets of Christianity, such as the resurrection. One can only say of such people that they may believe something, but they have no Christian faith. For Christian faith is not blind belief in all and everything, but only in what Boris Moraviev would call the objects of faith, objects outlined, if not exhaustively defined in the Creed, and for inner Christianity, particularly in the Nicene Creed. Quote, "If you do not believe," end quote, "nor will you understand the writings of men of faith." This kind of modern interpretation ignores the intentions of the authors of books such as the books of the Bible, assuming that you can interpret a passage in the same way, whatever the intentions of those who originally wrote it. It sometimes even assumes that you can interpret it idiosyncratically from your own personal point of view, and still consider that you are passing on to others a valid view of the text that you are interpreting. Such an approach is only credible to those who are completely ignorant of the process of writing in a conscientious way, or who imagine that earlier authors were such fools that the content, even of the great books of the Bible, is accidental, and that no specific purpose existed for them other than the today fashionable objective of self-expression. Those with experience of intentional writing for a specific aim, will realize that in such work the aim determines the method of expression, and that only an awareness of that original aim can accurately reveal the intended meanings of certain words whose interpretation is determined by their context. In particular, very great care is needed when interpreting even the most open text about inner teachings. As parables to illustrate inner truths, the early fathers of the Church repeatedly used biblical texts that appear to have a purely outer meaning. We must also realize that since the 2nd century, when the inner teaching went underground, those texts which illustrate some spiritual lesson with examples from the lives of those who had passed through the relevant experience in the past, as in Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses and other works on the same theme, actually were intended to be misinterpreted by anyone who had insufficient inner experience to understand their deeper meaning. The effects of taking such texts to have merely historical significance is just the confusion we observe in modern theology. One problem group of Greek words used throughout the history of the early church, in the Gospels, particularly St. Mark, in the epistles of Paul, and in the writings of the early fathers of the church, was that whose common modern form is gnosis. We can find records of the use of this word, gnosis, not remotely linked to what is now popularly called Gnosticism, as gnosis was originally simply a term for a special kind of knowledge, one of the properties of which is that it is not obtained through the senses. This idea, which will be discussed further in chapter 11, was summarized by the translator of Clement's Stromata thus, quote, "By gnosis, Clement understood the perfect knowledge of all that relates to God, his nature, and dispensations. He speaks of a twofold knowledge, one common to all men and born of sense, the other the genuine gnosis. This latter is not born with men, but must be gained by a practice, formed into a habit. The initiated find its perfection in a loving mysticism, which this never-failing love makes lasting." End quote. And Clement himself wrote, quote, "And the gnosis itself is that which has descended by transmission to a few, having been imparted unwritten by the apostles. Hence, then, knowledge or wisdom ought to be exercised up to the eternal and unchangeable habit of contemplation." End quote. But then, this book exists to help us recreate those old interpretive tools, and with them again to make connection with that ancient knowledge through just those channels used by those holy men of old through 3 processes. First, to draw on personal observation and direct experience related to the comments of others, so as to discover certain current concerns, personal as well as those concerning our whole civilization, to take cognizance of the experiences that give rise to them, to give an idea of why they have been forgotten or ignored for so many centuries, and finally to show how they are fundamental concerns that have lasted as long as Christendom and are often rooted in inner and often mystical experiences that have recurred since the earliest days of the Christian era. 2. To illuminate this by study of the esoteric tradition, so as to show how the early Christian tradition of inner knowledge relates to both personal and social concerns and experiences that have become important in our contemporary life. And 3, finally, to comment as necessary on the relation of the two in keeping with the methods of that early tradition and analyze them with tools of contemporary but not purely intellectual understanding. It should be noted in this last that this kind of understanding must include a full intellectual content, and with this there is always a danger that To the untrained mind, such a text will look as if it is pure intellectualism. As St. Nilus of Sora once did, I must ask pardon of my reader if anything appears in this work that is inconsistent with the sense of truth. To me, this means that if you do not recognize something from my description, I would ask you to classify it as untested until experience makes its accuracy or inaccuracy clear to you. But this is a good point to introduce an ancient practice, sometimes described in odd corners of the tradition, known today as pondering. To understand this book, certain parts of it, and there may be many of them, need to be pondered. Today we are so used to speed reading and other methods of reading superficially that we need to know a technique that most people perhaps once knew: what it means to ponder a statement. To ponder a passage of a book, we should first read it with great care, making sure that we have clearly dealt with each of its statements separately. Then we should ponder each statement on its own, comparing it with our own experience until we recognize what it describes. When we have recognized what is described in each statement, we may reconsider the passage as a whole. At this point, a characteristic sign is that it will seem less interesting. After all, it is not news. It is telling only things we already know. This sensation is a sign of success in our pondering. Without having learned to ponder, one should not read serious esoteric text.